There's a book that most people think they know. Its stories have been told for thousands of years. People recognize the names: Adam and Eve, Noah and the flood, Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, Babylon. Even those who have never read the Bible often know something about its most famous moments. Yet familiarity can sometimes hide something far more important. Many people know the individual stories of the Old Testament, but far fewer have ever stepped back and viewed them as a single, connected narrative stretching across nearly 2,000 years of history. What if the Old Testament is not simply a collection of ancient accounts preserved by a particular nation? What if every covenant, every migration, every kingdom, every war, every judgment, every restoration, and every promise forms part of one unfolding story moving toward a destination that remains just beyond the horizon? What if the same themes continue appearing from generation to generation, linking events separated by centuries and connecting people who never met one another? Understanding that larger story changes the way the entire Old Testament is read. To understand where that story begins, we must travel back before the rise of Israel, before the existence of nations, before the first city was built, and before human history itself had begun. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Genesis 1:1. The opening chapter of the Bible introduces a world moving from disorder to purpose. Darkness gives way to light. Dry land emerges from the waters. Living creatures fill the earth. Humanity appears as the final act of creation, uniquely described as bearing the image of God. Throughout the account, one phrase appears repeatedly: "And God saw that it was good." Genesis 1:10. The repetition is deliberate. The biblical narrative begins with a world functioning according to its intended design. Creation is not portrayed as random or accidental. It is presented as ordered, purposeful, and good. This opening chapter establishes a pattern that will quietly shape much of the Old Testament. Again and again, the story moves from disorder toward restoration, from crisis toward renewal, and from apparent collapse toward unexpected preservation. That pattern will emerge in ways that few readers notice when they focus only on individual events. Humanity's first home is the Garden of Eden, a place where God and humanity dwell together. Adam and Eve are given responsibility, purpose, and freedom. Yet within the opening pages of Scripture, that harmony is disrupted. A command is broken. Trust is fractured. The consequences extend far beyond a single act of disobedience. The relationship between humanity and God changes. Human relationships become marked by conflict and struggle. The ground itself is cursed. Pain, suffering, and death enter the human experience. What began in perfect order now begins moving toward corruption. The effects appear almost immediately. One generation later, Cain murders his brother Abel. Violence spreads through the growing population. Human civilization advances, but moral decline advances with it. As the generations pass, the biblical account presents a world increasingly dominated by corruption and violence. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6:5. The flood narrative emerges from this setting. Yet the flood is more than a story about judgment. It represents a dramatic reversal of creation itself. In Genesis, God brought order from the waters. During the flood, those waters return and cover the earth once again. The world appears to collapse back into chaos. Yet even here, the story does not end. Noah and his family survive within the ark. The waters eventually recede.
dry ground appears. Humanity receives a new beginning. The same pattern established in Genesis returns once again. Out of devastation comes restoration. Out of judgment comes preservation. After the flood, God establishes a covenant with Noah and his descendants, symbolized by the rainbow. Human history will continue. The story will continue. The purposes established at creation have not been abandoned.
What follows next is often overlooked because it appears at first glance to be a long list of names. Genesis 10 records the descendants of Noah and traces the spread of peoples and nations throughout the ancient world. Yet this chapter functions almost like an ancient map, explaining how humanity expanded across different regions and developed into distinct cultures and languages. The story then moves to Babel, where humanity gathers together in a remarkable display of unity and ambition. The people determined to build a city and a tower reaching toward heaven. Their goal is not merely architectural achievement, it reflects humanity's continuing desire to establish significance and security apart from God. The result is confusion and division. Languages are multiplied, people are scattered, nations emerge. Humanity once again finds itself fragmented. At this point, something unexpected happens. Rather than addressing all nations at once, God focuses on a single individual living in Mesopotamia. Through that individual, the biblical narrative begins a new chapter that will shape everything that follows. His name is Abraham. Abraham's story begins in Ur, one of the most important cities of the ancient world. This was a center of commerce, religion, and culture. Merchants traveled through its markets, priests served within its temples. Its influence extended across much of Mesopotamia. Abraham was not leaving behind a simple village. He was leaving behind the security of an established civilization. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. Genesis 12:1. The destination is not specified. The route is not explained. Instead, Abraham receives a promise. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Genesis 12:3. This promise is remarkable because it narrows the story to one family while simultaneously keeping the entire world in view. The nations scattered after Babel have not been forgotten. Instead, the story begins moving through Abraham and his descendants. The challenge is immediately obvious. Abraham has no heir. As years pass and both Abraham and Sarah grow older, the promise appears increasingly unlikely. The tension becomes one of the central themes of the patriarchal narratives. How can a great nation emerge from a man who has no child? The answer arrives through the birth of Isaac. His arrival represents far more than the birth of a long-awaited son. The future of the covenant now rests on a single child born under circumstances that seemed impossible. Through Isaac, the promise continues into the next generation. Isaac's son, Jacob, inherits that promise, though his life is marked by conflict, deception, and struggle. Unlike many legendary founders portrayed in ancient literature, Jacob is presented with remarkable honesty. His flaws are not hidden. His failures are recorded. Yet his story reaches a turning point during a mysterious night of wrestling that leaves him permanently changed. By dawn, Jacob receives a new name, Israel. That name eventually becomes the name of an entire people. It is a fitting beginning for a nation whose history will be marked by struggle, perseverance, failure, restoration, and an ongoing relationship with God that is often complex and difficult. Jacob's 12 sons become the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. Yet before they can become the foundation of a nation, the family experiences a crisis that threatens to tear it apart from within. Joseph, Jacob's favorite son,
becomes the target of his brother's jealousy. He is sold into slavery and carried to Egypt. What follows is one of the most remarkable narratives in the entire Old Testament. He experiences betrayal, servitude, false accusation, imprisonment, and apparent abandonment. Yet through a series of extraordinary events, he rises to become one of the most powerful figures in Egypt. Years later, when famine strikes the region, Joseph's brothers travel to Egypt seeking food. Unknowingly, they stand before the brother they once sold into slavery. The reunion that follows preserves not only a family, but also the future of the covenant itself. The descendants of Abraham settle in Egypt, where they grow in number and prosperity. What appears to be a season of security, however, is quietly preparing the stage for one of the most important events in biblical history. Generations pass. Egypt changes. A new pharaoh rises to power, one who knows nothing of Joseph or the service he once rendered to the nation. The descendants of Abraham are no longer honored guests. They become slaves. And the story is about to enter the chapter that will define Israel's identity for centuries to come.
The story of the Old Testament now enters a period that would shape the identity, worship, memory, and future expectations of Israel more than any other event in its history. For centuries, the descendants of Abraham had lived in Egypt. What began as a refuge during famine gradually became a place of oppression. Generation after generation was born into slavery. The people multiplied, but they did not possess freedom. They built cities they would never own, served rulers who did not know their history, and lived under a system designed to benefit the empire rather than themselves. Yet even during those centuries of silence, the promises given to Abraham had not been forgotten. The biblical narrative introduces Moses at precisely this moment. Born during a period when Hebrew infant boys were being targeted by Pharaoh's decree, Moses survives through a series of events that seem unlikely when viewed individually, but appear providential when viewed together. He's raised within the Pharaoh's household, educated in the culture of Egypt, yet never entirely separated from his own people. Years later, after fleeing Egypt and spending decades in Midian, Moses encounters something extraordinary in the wilderness. At a mountain far removed from the centers of power, God calls him to return to Egypt and confront Pharaoh. What follows becomes the defining act of deliverance in the Old Testament. The confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh is not merely a political dispute between a ruler and a prophet. It is presented as a contest between human power and divine authority. Egypt stood among the most powerful civilizations in the ancient world. Its monuments, armies, wealth, and traditions projected an image of permanence. Yet the Exodus narrative repeatedly demonstrates that no earthly power is beyond God's reach. A series of plagues moves through Egypt, disrupting the foundations of daily life and challenging the assumptions upon which Egyptian confidence rested. The Nile, the source of life for the nation, is struck. Darkness covers the land, crops fail, livestock perish. Finally, the death of the firstborn brings Pharaoh to a point he had resisted throughout the entire narrative. Israel is released. For the first time in generations, the descendants of Abraham leave Egypt not as slaves, but as a people moving toward a future promised centuries earlier. The crossing of the Red Sea becomes one of the most memorable scenes in biblical history. Trapped between Pharaoh's advancing army and an impassable body of water, the Israelites appear to have reached the end of their journey before it is truly begun. Yet the sea parts, the people cross safely, and the pursuing Egyptian forces are overwhelmed. The event becomes more than a historical memory. Throughout the remainder of the Old Testament, the Exodus serves as proof that God is able to rescue his people even when circumstances appear impossible. Yet freedom creates a new challenge.
Leaving Egypt is easier than removing Egypt from the hearts and minds of people who have lived there for centuries. The wilderness journey that follows is often viewed simply as a period of wandering, but the biblical narrative presents it as something much deeper. Israel is no longer learning how to survive as slaves, they are learning how to live as a covenant people. For 40 years, the wilderness becomes a place of testing, instruction, failure, correction, and growth. Each day brings dependence. Manna appears in the morning, water is provided in barren places, guidance comes through the presence of God rather than through military strength or political influence. The lessons are often difficult, complaints emerge, rebellions occur, doubts surface repeatedly. Yet beneath every challenge lies the same question: will these people trust the God who brought them out of Egypt? At Mount Sinai, the story reaches another major turning point. Here, Israel receives the law. Modern readers sometimes view the commandments primarily as rules, but within the biblical narrative, they function as something larger. They establish the framework for a unique relationship between God and His people. The covenant at Sinai transforms a former slave population into a nation with a distinct identity, purpose, and calling. The tabernacle is constructed during this period as well. More than a portable place of worship, it symbolizes something that has been central since the opening chapters of Genesis: God's desire to dwell among His people. The theme that began in Eden now reappears in the wilderness. Yet despite these extraordinary experiences, Israel struggles repeatedly. Fear, impatience, and unbelief delay their progress. A journey that could have taken weeks stretches into decades. An entire generation passes before the nation is finally prepared to enter the land promised to Abraham centuries earlier. Moses himself does not enter the land. After leading Israel through some of the most important events in its history, he dies within sight of the destination. Leadership passes to Joshua.
Under Joshua's leadership, Israel crosses the Jordan River and begins establishing itself within Canaan. The conquest is difficult and often complex. Cities must be taken, territories must be secured. Different tribes settle in different regions. The process unfolds over years rather than days. Yet even after entering the land, another challenge emerges. Possessing a homeland does not automatically produce faithfulness. The period of the Judges follows, and it reveals one of the recurring patterns that runs throughout the Old Testament. Again and again, the people prosper, become complacent, drift away from God, encounter crisis, cry out for help, and experience deliverance through leaders raised up for specific moments. The cycle repeats so often that it becomes impossible to miss. The Book of Judges contains stories of remarkable courage, military victories, personal failures, and national instability. It is one of the most honest portraits of human nature found anywhere in ancient literature. The people repeatedly receive opportunities to learn from their past, yet they repeatedly return to the same mistakes. The period ends with a sobering observation that summarizes much of the era. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. The nation desires stability. It desires leadership. It desires unity. Eventually, those desires lead to the establishment of a monarchy. Saul becomes Israel's first king. He possesses many of the qualities people typically look for in a ruler. He is impressive in appearance, capable in battle, and initially successful. Yet his reign reveals a lesson that appears repeatedly throughout Scripture. External qualifications cannot compensate for internal disobedience. Saul's failures eventually lead to the rise of a very different figure. David enters the story as a shepherd from Bethlehem. He is not the obvious choice. Even members of his own family appear surprised when he is selected. Yet David's life becomes one of the most influential narratives in the Old Testament. His victory over Goliath establishes him as a national figure. His military successes expand Israel's influence. His leadership unifies the tribes. Most importantly, he captures Jerusalem and establishes it as the political and spiritual center of the nation. Jerusalem will remain at the heart of biblical history for centuries. David is far from perfect. The biblical narrative records both his greatest achievements and his most serious failures. Yet, despite those failures, a covenant is established with him that becomes one of the most important promises in Scripture. God promises that David's dynasty will endure and that his throne will hold significance beyond his own lifetime. That promise becomes a thread running through the remainder of the Old Testament. The next chapter of the story belongs to David's son, Solomon. Under Solomon, Israel reaches a period of unprecedented prosperity. Trade expands, wealth increases, international influence grows. Construction projects reshape the kingdom. Yet even at the height of national success, warning signs begin to appear. Solomon's heart gradually turns away from complete devotion to God. Compromises that seem small at first eventually produce consequences that extend far beyond his own reign. The kingdom appears stronger than ever. In reality, cracks are already forming beneath the surface. And those cracks are about to reshape the future of Israel, Jerusalem, and the entire biblical story. Following Solomon's death, the United Kingdom begins to unravel. What had appeared strong and secure from the outside proves far more fragile beneath the surface. Political tensions that had been building for years finally erupt, and the nation divides into two separate kingdoms. To the north stands the Kingdom of Israel, consisting of 10 tribes. To the south remains the Kingdom of Judah, centered around Jerusalem and ruled by the descendants of David. The division marks one of the most significant turning points in Old Testament history, because it transformed a united people into rival kingdoms, each facing its own political, military, and spiritual challenges.
The Northern Kingdom quickly establishes alternative centers of worship in an effort to prevent its people from traveling to Jerusalem. What begins as a political strategy soon becomes a spiritual disaster. The same tendency that appeared in Eden resurfaced in the wilderness and continued throughout the period of the Judges emerges once again. Human beings continue searching for ways to enjoy God's blessings while resisting God's authority. As the years pass, both kingdoms experience periods of prosperity and decline. Some kings pursue justice and faithfulness. Others lead the people deeper into idolatry and corruption. Yet throughout these centuries, another group of figures begins to dominate the biblical narrative: the prophets. Men such as Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Amos, Micah, Ezekiel, and many others stand before kings, confront nations, and call God's people back to covenant faithfulness. Their message is often unpopular because it exposes uncomfortable truths. They warn that no nation, no matter how privileged, is exempt from the consequences of rebellion. For a time, those warnings appear to be ignored. Eventually, the Northern Kingdom reaches a point from which it cannot recover. Political instability grows, spiritual decline deepens, foreign powers become stronger. Then, in 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire conquers Israel. Cities fall, populations are deported. The Northern Kingdom disappears from history as an independent nation. For the first time since the conquest of Canaan, a large portion of God's covenant people no longer possesses a homeland. The southern kingdom of Judah survives longer. Jerusalem remains standing. The temple continues operating. The descendants of David still occupy the throne. For a while, it appears that Judah may avoid the fate that overtook its northern neighbor. Yet many of the same problems remain. The prophets continue speaking. The warnings continue coming. The calls to repentance continue being ignored. Meanwhile, a new empire is rising in the east, Babylon. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon becomes the dominant power of the ancient world. Kingdom after kingdom falls beneath its influence. Eventually, Babylon turns its attention toward Jerusalem. The result is one of the most devastating chapters in the entire Old Testament. Babylon invades Judah repeatedly. Captives are taken away. Wealth is removed. Resistance weakens. Finally, in 586 BC, Jerusalem falls. The city is devastated. Its walls are torn down. Its leaders are carried into exile. Most significantly, the temple is destroyed. For generations, the temple had stood as the visible symbol of God's presence among his people. It represented worship, identity, memory, and hope. To see it reduced to rubble would have seemed unthinkable. The destruction raises painful questions. Had God abandoned his people? Had the covenant failed? Was the story over? Many of the exiles must have wondered whether everything that began with Abraham had finally come to an end. Yet, even in exile, the story continues. Daniel rises within the courts of Babylon. Ezekiel receives visions among the captives. Jeremiah continues proclaiming hope even amid catastrophe. And the message of the prophets begins to shift. They still speak about judgment, but increasingly they speak about restoration. They describe a future return. They describe renewed hearts. They describe a covenant deeper than the one written on stone tablets. Most remarkably, they begin describing a future figure whose significance appears greater than any king, prophet, priest, or leader who came before. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. In Isaiah 53. At the time, the full meaning of such prophecies remained unclear, yet they introduced expectations that would continue growing throughout the remainder of Old Testament history. Eventually, Babylon falls. Persia rises. Under Cyrus the Great, a decree is issued allowing the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland. For the first time in decades, restoration becomes possible. Groups of exiles make the long journey back to Judah. Yet what they return to is not the kingdom their ancestors once knew. Jerusalem lies in ruins. Resources are limited. The population is small. The glory of Solomon's age exists only in memory. Nevertheless, rebuilding begins. The temple is reconstructed. The walls of Jerusalem are restored. Public worship returns. The law is read before the people. The covenant community begins taking shape once again. Yet even during this restoration, something feels incomplete. The city has returned. The people have returned. But the promises seem larger than the reality being experienced. The Ark of the Covenant is gone. The monarchy has not been restored to its former glory. Foreign powers still dominate the region. The prophets had spoken of a future that appears greater than anything currently visible. As the Old Testament approaches its conclusion, anticipation begins replacing resolution. The promises made to Abraham still seem larger than a single nation. The covenant made with David still appears greater than any earthly throne. The visions of the prophets reach beyond anything accomplished during the return from exile. The story seems to be pointing somewhere beyond itself. Then something unusual happens. The prophetic voice falls silent. For centuries, prophets had appeared throughout Israel's history. Kings rose and fell. Empires expanded and collapsed. Yet God's messengers continued speaking. Now the record becomes quiet. Generation after generation waits. The silence lasts for centuries. No new prophet appears in the biblical record. No final resolution arrives. Yet the expectation remains. When viewed as a whole, the Old Testament is far more than a collection of ancient stories. It is a continuous narrative stretching nearly 2,000 years of history, connecting generations that never met, kingdoms that rose and fell, and promises that survived every crisis. It begins with creation itself and follows humanity through the fall, the flood, Babel, Abraham, Egypt, the Exodus, the wilderness, the kingdom, the exile, and the return. Again and again, human beings fail. Empires rise and fall. Cities are built and destroyed. Kingdoms appear and disappear. Yet the promise never disappears. By the time the final pages are reached, the reader begins to realize that the Old Testament is not ultimately the story of Israel's success. In many ways, it is the story of humanity's inability to fully restore what was lost in the beginning.
The garden is lost. The promise remains. The people are delivered. The struggle remains. The kingdom is established. The problem remains. The exiles return. The longing remains. And perhaps that is the most important realization of all. The Old Testament does not end with everything resolved. It ends with expectation. The story that began in a garden has not yet reached its destination. The promises are still alive. The hope remains. And after nearly 2,000 years of history, that expectation becomes the final message of the Old Testament itself. The story pauses, the world waits, and something important is about to happen. But that is where the Old Testament leaves us. A world shaped by covenant, prophecy, kingdoms, exile, restoration, and expectation. A world still waiting for the promises to be fulfilled. A world still waiting for the arrival of the figure the prophets described centuries earlier. Because the story of the Bible was never meant to end with the Old Testament. In many ways, everything we have covered so far has been preparation. Preparation for the next chapter. Preparation for the arrival of Jesus of Nazareth. Preparation for events that would transform not only Israel, but the entire world. And that story is every bit as remarkable as the one we have just explored. So if you want to understand how the promises, prophecies, covenants, and expectations of the Old Testament continue into the life of Jesus, the rise of the early church, and the spread of Christianity across the Roman world, continue with our next documentary, The Entire History of the New Testament. Because the clearest understanding of either testament comes when both are viewed together as parts of one extraordinary story.